In this video, I will share some details of the flow B. Okay, the flow B. Here is the documentation. So before we start, we need to create one consumer. Okay, let me create a consumer. Here, login, username and password. Get app key. Hello. Here I type in HTTP. And here I input one client certificate. Let me find one. Okay, I use the user certificate, copy it, paste that here. Type the description. Okay. Okay, success. Let me copy the corresponding auth2 properties. Create a new consumer. Okay, here it is ready. And before we call the flow, we must prepare the bank ID and the consent ID. Okay, we call the bank ID. We call this endpoint to get all the banks. Here I use the postman. You know, the endpoint protected by the MTLers, so we need to import the client certificate. Okay, the client certificate localhost. The user certificate and the user key. And here is the password. Okay. Okay, we get all the banks, and let me select one bank ID at here. So we get the first parameter, the prepare bank ID and consent ID, bank ID. We have the bank ID and create the consent ID. Okay, let's go on. We can call this endpoint to create one consent. Before we call this endpoint, we need supply one access token. No, here we create one client credential access token. Client credentials access token. Okay, at first we need one JWT that send with the JWK private key. Where is this parameter? The parameter at here. This is the JWK private key. Okay, let me create the claims explained at here. So the sub and the issue is just the client ID, and here is the token endpoint, expiration time and issue time, and this JWT ID. So let me copy it. we need create JWT. So here the client ID and here client ID, and here is the Hazor token endpoint, HTTP. Okay, here is the token endpoint, and expiration time make it much bigger, and the issue time here is the JWT ID here, and create this JWT with send with this private key, JWT private key. Okay, you can use any util, and here I will use one online util to create that one. Here is online util. Okay, and copy the payload and the private key. Here, please pay attention. This we need to select ES256. Okay, ready. Let's generate. Okay, we get the JWT. Okay, we get the JWT. Here we get the JWT and continue. Okay, now we need to create one client credentials access token. Okay, we use the Postman to call this endpoint. The Postman at here. The Postman, the client ID, let me copy the client ID. Client ID at here. The grant type client credentials. And the client assertion type, it is fixed value. And the client assertion is just this JWT. Copy this JWT, paste at here. Okay, it's ready. Let me send. Now we get the client credentials access token. Credentials. Okay, the next step, we get this access token. Now it is ready to create the consent. Now we need to create the consent with that access token. The corresponding endpoint is this one. Okay, let me copy the access token and call this endpoint. Send. Okay, success. Let me check the consent ID. The consent ID. Copy it. We have consent ID. We have the consent ID. Now we can start the auth2 flow. All the corresponding parameter. Let me copy and fill the values. Start auth2 flow. Here is one URL. Here, the Hazor URL. The Hazor URL. copy and paste it here. Here the redirect URL, we need to use this value, but because it in the URL, we need to encode the value. So copy this value and encode. We can use online util to encode the URL. Here, the online util, paste that here, encode. Okay, we get the value, go back, we need write word and replace the URL. The state and value, and the client ID we need to replace with our client ID. And the bank ID, well, ready the bank ID here. The bank ID. And the consent ID, let me copy the consent ID. The consent ID, okay, check again. All the value correct. Okay. Here is not HTTPS. Let me delete it and open the link. Okay, we start the auth2 flow. Username, password, submit. Check the accounts and confirm. Okay, to confirm, we get the code right here. We get the code value. Okay, after this step, we get the auth2 code. And we can use the code to exchange the access token and the ID token. Before we call the token endpoint, we need to also prepare another JWT, the step as before, as this step. So repeat this step to prepare one JWT. Okay, prepare one JWT. This is the payload, copy it, and the util at here. The content, the ID, the client ID, and the expiration time. The JWT ID need change, and no, JWT need change. Here is the JW key, private key. Okay, generate, copy it. Let me name it JWT2. Okay, we got the JWT. Call the token endpoint to exchange code to access token. Okay, let's open the Postman. And this time the grant type is authorization code. So grant type change to authorization code, and the client assertion is JWT2. Paste at here. Client ID. Let's check the client ID. Client ID is correct. Okay, the code value, this value. Okay, let me call this endpoint. Now we get the error because we didn't supply the redirect URI. The redirect URI here. Now let me try again. Okay, from the response we get the access token and the ID token. We can check the ID token. Copy it. JWT. Here is the client certificate hash value right here. And the access token. With the access token, we can call the endpoint. For example, we can call this endpoint. We get the correct access token. Okay, send. We can also get other endpoints. For example, this endpoint get all the accounts. Okay, send. The method change to get. Okay, send. We get the result. Okay, this is the detail of the flow B. Just follow the documentation, and I will upload the video and the link at here. Okay, that's all. Bye bye.